Thanks very much. And thanks to everyone who's turned up today to listen to this presentation. I'm going to be addressing veterinary education and training, firstly by looking at some of the background to the nature of education and the levels that we're addressing, and then looking at the different types of alternatives, followed by some example clips within canine abdominal surgery, then exploring the wider pedagogical and other benefits of using humane innovations and other ethical approaches before we come to the conclusion. So the title is Enhancing Veterinary Education and Training Through Humane Innovations. And let's just have a little look, a taste at some of these humane innovations. The first is a virtual laboratory. In this case, it's a muscle physiology virtual laboratory produced at the Institute of Physiology at the University of Marburg in Germany. Here we have part of the intestines of the Sindava canine, for which you'll see some clips a little bit later. And this is practicing enterotomy and anastomosis for advanced surgery training. We can also look at the body donation programs to provide ethically sourced animal cadavers, which can provide an alternative to the killing of animals for dissection, but also materials for plastination and for some clinical skills and surgical procedures as well. So that's just a little taste of some of what we'll be looking at during this presentation. So in terms of context and definitions, animal experimentation, as you will be aware, is found in a number of different fields. Education and training, which is the topic for the presentation today, research, and testing. Education and training is different from pure and applied science in the sense that it's not research, the acquisition of new knowledge, rather than known knowledge, and nor is it testing of drugs and chemicals in applied research and for regulatory purposes. But education and training humane education and training is a prerequisite for humane research and testing. Humane training and familiarity with alternatives at the undergraduate level is very important in terms of the skills and the knowledge that graduates will be leaving their courses and entering into the professions with. Similarly, education and training continues onwards with professional development work within the professions itself. So we'll be talking about the education and training of students, but first let's look at the different areas of education and training. The first is of students and the general public about alternatives, primarily in research and testing. This is an informational issue. There's no direct replacement. And the second area is training of scientists and technicians and assessors and others in the use of alternatives for application in research and testing. This is more on scientific and technical skills. There's imminent or future replacement linked to it. The third is the education and training of students and trainees, today's topic. Within secondary, higher and professional levels, through the use of alternatives to gain knowledge, skills and attitudes. So it's very different in terms of it being a pedagogical issue, not learning about alternatives, but learning through the process of applying such tools. So they are the tools for education, and this is about pedagogical and technical skills. Replacement is also achieved through their implementation. We can also realize that this includes the special case of training through the use of alternatives to gain skills for laboratory animal use in research and testing. We're not going to be addressing that specifically in this talk, but there are, of course, many different tools for replacement in the training of lab animal staff. But the training also leads into continuation of that practice. And as that area is facing a lot of potential replacement in research and testing, this is another different area that you can find out in other materials. This is still technical skills, and there's partial replacement, but as I say, the profession is therefore further endorsed and not challenged. So looking at secondary, higher and professional levels, in higher education, we can look at the structure. There's veterinary, medical and biology faculties where animals or alternatives might be used. Within each of these faculties, there are different disciplines such as anatomy, pathology, physiology, pharmacology, and for the medical and veterinary medical professions, clinical skills and surgery as well. Again, within those, there are the practical classes and training events within the specific courses. Now, the majority of conventional animal use has been harmful, and it might comprise the dissection of animals killed for that purpose, animal experimentation, the use of living animals, and other instrumental animal use that is neither dissection nor animal experimentation. But I think it's worth remembering there are also humane traditions by individual country, by discipline, by specific practical class. So, for example, veterinary surgery in the UK is generally learned with non-animal models, non-animal methods, and then work with animal patients in a clinical healing environment. And there are differences across the world. At the same time, there's a lot of similarity between the teaching objectives that are required within each of these disciplines across the world too. So there's both commonality and difference here. There's also significant ongoing replacement and progress towards humane education. So I think it's quite an exciting time with the implementation of tools that use the power of technology to support the learning process, and also the development of good materials that also can contribute to that process too. So we're talking about curricular design, which enables teaching objectives to be met using humane alternative methods. Then animals are free from harm, and students and trainees have freedom of conscience. And humane education and training also helps develop the skills, the qualities of critical thinking, emotional and ethical literacy, and the sense of responsibility, of conscientiousness. If we're talking about replacement of harmful animal use, we need to define harm. So we define it as any action, deliberate or otherwise, that impinges on an animal's current or future well-being by denying or limiting any of the following freedoms. Freedom to live, because taking a life is a significant form of harm. Freedom to express full natural behavior from pain, injury, and disease. And you can read more about this at the InterNICHE policy on our website. There's also a broader issue here when we look at harm. There are more animal welfare and ecological aspects concerning the use of animals harmfully. So it's beyond the practical class. It involves capture, breeding, transportation, caging and keeping, the experiments or killing themselves, preservation and disposal. So we're looking at, when you look at the whole picture, the full life cycle, we could say, then you can see the impact is negative in many different areas. And we'll explore how the humane innovations and the other ethical approaches can remove or limit some of these negative impacts, and indeed can bring in other positive impacts as well. Now, what about education about ethics, about animals, animal welfare, about alternatives? In our opinion, teaching about these areas whilst also practicing the harmful animal use is inconsistent, and the lessons might be negated by that harmful animal use. So the use of replacement alternatives in education is a significant aspect of that ethics and alternatives and animal welfare education put into practice. These things need to be parallel. Similarly, how about the 3 R's of replacement, reduction, and refinement? How are they helpful or relevant for education and training? Well, the 3Rs comes from more of a laboratory animal science perspective rather than a pedagogical one. It's science and technical aspects, not pedagogical and about the acquisition of knowledge and skills. So we believe there's a limited relevance to the 3Rs here. Still, even within the 3Rs perspective, replacement is prioritized and is the objective. So we'd like to redefine the 3Rs when it comes to education and training. Firstly, to make it stricter. Full replacement is feasible in education and training, so we can talk about 1R, not 3Rs. And we can redefine the definition to make it smarter and more relevant. Replacement solutions might indeed involve animals within education and training, particularly for zoology and veterinary medicine. It can still be fully humane, and there's zero additional harm, but it may well involve animals. And maybe we can consider retirement of the 3Rs and instead focus on enhanced education and training. There's also a myth, I think, that is important to address. The myth is that animal experimentation is somehow the real thing and that alternatives are not. But I think when we look at this and identify what might be behind it, we can realize that this might confuse the method with the objective. Animal experimentation, for example, is just one method, and there are other methods too. The real thing is not the animal experiment, it's effective gaining of knowledge and skills and positive attitudes and values. So in summary, it's a matter of curricular design, of defining teaching objectives, and the choice of tools and approaches to enhance the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Our aim and focus as InterNICHE, the International Network for Humane Education, is therefore to help achieve full replacement of harmful animal use and the implementation of humane alternatives to support education and training. So what are the different types of alternative? This is part 2 of the presentation. First, what's the definition? They're educational tools or teaching approaches that can replace harmful animal use and meet teaching objectives. And in many departments, we can remember that alternatives are now the norm. They're now the standard way of doing things. So in fact, we don't need to necessarily use the word alternatives anymore because they are the standard and better way of doing things. We can talk about non-animal tools, and we can talk about humane approaches that involve animals, fully humane approaches. And we can consider this to be about neutral or beneficial impact on those individual animals. There are film and video, models, mannequins, and simulators, computer simulation with augmented reality and virtual reality as well, ethically sourced animal cadavers, organs, and tissue, clinics with animal patients, teaching hospitals, and also animal volunteers that we'll talk about later, student self-experimentation, in vitro laboratories, and ethical field studies. So now let's look at each of these in turn. Film and video, of course, have been used for decades to further illustrate structure in particular, but also particular clinical procedures. And of course, this is a stills image from a bird dissection, and you can see it's taken from a professionally performed dissection. So there's good resolution. Students are unlikely to make mistakes in this way like they might do with a real dissection, with also wasting the animal's life as well. And instead, they can learn about the anatomy. They can learn comparative anatomy between species. And of course, with digital video, you can go back and forth to look at the dissection itself and the anatomy lessons within it. This is not hands-on, of course, it's passive, but it doesn't mean that every individual tool needs to meet all the teaching objectives. We always use a combination of tools in any subject in order to meet teaching objectives. So this is one of several that can be used within anatomy. Models, mannequins, and simulators is a large area, Models, of course, have been used for hundreds of years to illustrate anatomy and beyond. On the left, you can see a large equine model, which of course can be taken apart. And there is also often labeling with such models. And this, again, gives a lot of time for students and trainees to be able to understand the anatomy and the spatial elements of anatomy. On the right, you can see a clay model. Clay and plasticine can be used to build up the anatomy onto a skeleton of different animals. And this is a very considered and slow approach, and it's a creative approach. Anatomy is often focused on dissection and taking apart, whereas a model is what it is, and a clay or plasticine model is very creative. So I think this is very good for students to be able to understand the position of different organs, different muscles, and how they relate to each other. And I think it's that creative element is also very, very important. 3D printing, of course, is a rapidly growing field. Bioprinting is also increasingly being refined and improved. 3D printing allows the production of bones, organs, other materials, suture pads, for example, within an institute's own location. So we don't need to buy material from elsewhere, don't need to ship it and import it. I think it's very valuable in terms of local production of tools that are fully relevant to the local curriculum. And despite the similarity between curricula across the world, there are also differences in terms of different species that certain regions of the world might be addressing within their veterinary course. And tools like this can really sort of help with that localization, as well as saving money, of course, as well. Models such as suture pads, again, can be bought. We don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time or produce things locally by necessity. There are also some very good tools that can be bought from across the world, as well as material you can make yourself. This is a 5-layer suture pad. In this case, it's one with a vessel, so you can practice not only those basic surgical skills such as eye-hand coordination, how to hold a needle driver, developing that muscle memory that's so crucial to master at the early stage of surgical training. But you could also learn about vessels and bleeding and the management of bleeding, of course, as well. There are many different tools of many different levels of fidelity, and you don't necessarily need a high fidelity model at the beginning of the range of surgical training skill sets that will progress over the years of veterinary degree. But good tools like this that are have sufficient fidelity, sufficient level of realism, can be really excellent for providing a good tool and a good environment to master those skills for students to build the confidence and competence, and for the teachers to be able to assess that and be comfortable too, before going on to the next stage within the clinical skills and surgical training. There are also specific models dealing with specific species and organs and limbs and so on. In this case, this is a rabbit ear for taking blood and giving injections within the rabbit ear. So a lot of different tools available. And as was mentioned earlier, the InterNICHE Alternatives Database, which is a free access database with over 1,500 tools that are marketed by producers, companies, and universities as institutes that can market products they've developed themselves for use in their own courses, can be found on our website. So you can look up by and filter by species, by procedure, and see what is already available. Here you can see the Sindaba canine that we'll be looking at in a little bit more detail during the talk. In this case, you can practice intubation. You can practice specific processes such as anesthesia. So you have a simulated environment, and there's a wide range of different tools that the more advanced mannequins like this can help you practice. And this shows just the head and the neck, but the whole model as a surgical canine can give a lot of different opportunities through its many functionalities. And different tools, like I say, have different degrees of fidelity and different ranges of functionalities that you can experience and work with within a course. And of course, any of these tools can be contextualized within the specific practical class that's being organized by a university and then adapted because they're often very, very flexible. Here you can see critical care Jerry. That's the dog, not the professor. In this case, critical care Jerry, which has a number of different functionalities, has been further adapted and has been linked to more engineering tools and a heart pump, so that simulated clinical environments for teaching clinical pharmacology can be developed. And this is at Cornell University in the US, at the veterinary faculty there. And in fact, in our future episodes of our film series on veterinary education and training, you will see interviews and footage of these labs. And what this gives is an opportunity to practice a whole scenario, the whole clinical pharmacology situation, different virtual patients with different conditions, where students can be faced with these challenges and need to assess the dog and work out how to treat that dog. In the next room will be other students watching those students in this practical training lab, and then the students swap, and they all discuss together where they could have done a bit better, where they made a mistake, what went well. And I think that gives a very good equal, cooperative, collaborative environment for students to reflect on the learning process. So while I think these tools are often really excellent in terms of reflecting a greater sensitivity to the learning process, what are the teaching objectives and how best to meet them? Also, it's about what context you provide as a teacher in order to optimize the learning opportunities within the practical class as well. And I think this is a very good example of where clinical pharmacology can be learnt in a simulated clinic environment before those students will be working later with animal patients in the veterinary teaching hospital. They've already gone through such scenarios, and that's really valuable. Here you can see a spay-neuter model. This has a male and female insert. You don't necessarily need the whole dog model. But again, like all of these models and mannequins, they give the opportunity for students to practice and practice and practice again until they and their teachers are happy with the level of competence and, of course, the confidence too, before going on to the next stage. So they're very important, I think, for students to practice. I've spoken to people working with vets and vets who've said they've often had little or no opportunity to practice some of these procedures. And the opportunity to have access to models where they can really practice all the different elements of their skills acquisition needed for a spay or a neuter has been very valuable. And they certainly have reflected on their own education and saw what perhaps was lacking within it. Of course, there's also the time when were models developed, what was available before, but certainly now there are so many good models and mannequins that there's no excuse for not providing, I think, students the opportunity to practice on such excellent tools. There is a range of economic aspects here, of course, as well. Some mannequins or virtual reality models are much more expensive. Others are completely free. Some software is very cheap. Some models are cheap as well. But there's a wide range there. And there's also the opportunity to produce materials yourself within your own institute, of course. Here you can see the Sindava canine, which we'll be looking at a few clips of shortly. This is produced in the US and is increasingly being used in veterinary faculties across the world. It's a high fidelity model where you have, like I said, a range of different organs and tissue and functionalities associated with those within the model. The whole model itself can last decades, but the individual organs, as they're being used, of course, will need to be replaced. But there's so much intestine, for example, within this model that you have a lot of opportunities for students to be practicing enterotomies and resections and anastomoses on the intestine. And then that material itself can be used by the more junior surgical students who can watch video clips of procedures and work with the isolated small piece of the bowel as well. So creative use of this material between the sort of more advanced students and the more basic students can also allow for its conscientious use, which can also save money as well. So here on the right, you can see a foreign body has been found within the intestine, and we'll see a little bit more about this in the forthcoming clip. Such models are used on stations where groups of students, in this case, 2 students per station, can work with the model and might have a whole afternoon working through 3 different procedures. When we were filming this lab at Cornell, again, the students were first doing a cystotomy, then working with the enterotomy, resection, and anastomosis, and finally doing an emergency procedure in order to practice dealing with the stress and the time pressures to address a dropped ovarian pedicle that would follow a spay. You can see a close-up of the enterotomy, and you can see there's an anastomosis below. Very high resolution, high fidelity models. But like I said, this isn't necessary for every level. So this is the more advanced surgical, abdominal surgical procedures. But I think for this level, it's really good to have a high fidelity model. Many veterinary faculties are of course, developing very comprehensive and large clinical skills labs and surgical skills labs. And you can increasingly see these providing students the opportunity to be often 24-hour access, otherwise supervised work on a wide range of different models and mannequins, addressing everything from basic surgical skills right up to more advanced surgical procedures. It's also worth noting, I think, that some of these labs have very simple models too. So for a specific procedure like some part of a castration or anesthesia, you can have simulations made from very, very simple models, from rubber bands and condoms and toys from toy shops, that can nevertheless still provide an opportunity for students to practice the very specific element of a process or a procedure for which a high fidelity model is not needed. But before that and after that, even more low fidelity models and then high fidelity models together combine the range of different opportunities for skills acquisition and different specific individual teaching objectives within them over the course of that degree. Multimedia, computer simulation, is of course another important area of non-animal alternatives. On the left here, you can see a dissection software. You can do what is a virtual dissection. You can look at the different organs and organ systems. You can highlight them. There's overlays and labels and information. You can also look at different magnifications, so the macro and micro anatomy, pathologies, and you can compare between species. Again, flexible material, bringing in all the power of technology to support the learning process with hundreds, if not thousands, of different images and labels. On the right, you can see the virtual canine anatomy from Colorado State University. VCA is freeware, so it's available for free download. And this is a very complex software, a lot of material in it. There is both dissection and radiology. Within dissection, there's superficial and deep dissection of different areas. This is the deep dissection of the head, you can see in this image. And there's multiple levels for that deep dissection. And on each of these levels, there are labels when you click on the structure in the image, or you can click on the information, the name of the structure on the left in the menu, and you'll have it highlighted on the image. And below you can see more information on each of those structures with hyperlinks taking you to other structures or further information. So really, again, you've got a huge amount of visual information and written information that would take some muscle to carry a large, heavy book, and a lot of money to print such a book as well. This has now been produced and is available for free. It's a very, very good resource, and I think it can really help with visualization, which is such an important aspect of anatomy. The veterinary faculty has also further developed a virtual reality model, which we will be featuring in our film series later, for use within the university only. And this again adds an extra level of immersion and realism to the process of visualizing anatomical structures. Virtual laboratories are more interactive and have an opportunity for students to input more data and to try out different settings on the apparatus. This, as I mentioned before in the image, is the muscle physiology software. The virtual physiology series from the University of Marburg includes sim nerve, sim muscle, sim patch, sim vessel, sim heart, with a direct simulation of the animal experiment and showing the experimental approach to understanding and gaining the knowledge behind these different aspects of physiology and the pharmacological aspects of the physiology too. So you set this up. There's an algorithm that produces the data. So every student will get different results, including sometimes things not working. The differences between the information that the students are presented with also allow for teachers to be able to monitor how authentically the student has done the practical class and worked with the data they've been presented. So it allows the teacher to identify issues and pushes the student to really do the practical class themselves properly. And the students also have the opportunity here to be much more self-directed in the learning. They can work in small teams. They can work through the knowledge that the simulation can present to the student and that the student can learn from the experiment. Of course, students have the opportunity to go backwards and forwards in order to make sure they've really understood certain principles and can move on to the next stage. Initially, when Professor Brown, who developed this, was faced with a whole class of students who conscientiously objected and refused to do the experiments, thinking that they weren't sufficiently, or they weren't ethical at all, and that there must be good alternatives with the increasing power of computers for production of software. He was not happy. He thought that the animal experiment was indeed the best approach to learn the principles of physiology. But after a year or so of developing the software, testing it with the students, and then looking at their results and how they learned, he realized that actually, no, the simulation was better because it did provide students the opportunity to learn through doing and to, as I say, keep revising principles, understanding, making sure they understood things effectively before going on to the next stage. So he then became quite a fan of simulations and also applied those in his research, bringing about a lot of replacement in his neurophysiology research as well. Some of these softwares are extremely cheap. Others are a little bit more expensive, but in the case of the virtual physiology series, these are free access for students. Institutes need to buy them, but students can have free access. And as with much software, and indeed some models or basic mannequins, students can often work from home in order to keep on working in these practical classes outside of the limitations of the lab. So I think that gives a lot of opportunity again for students to be more engaged in their in the learning process and really just have the chance to try things out to a much greater degree. There's also animations, of course, within the field of computer simulation. This is from the Glass Horse equine colic software produced at the University of Georgia in the US. And such animations, of course, allow you to visualize structure and conditions developing, as well as simulate examinations such as rectal examinations in horses or cows for that matter, and understand what you might be looking for and how to address that. This software in particular also has radiology too, and I think gives a very good opportunity to visualize, again, structure and the development of conditions and diseases through the university's investment in animations and computer simulation. There's also a wide range of apps that you can use on your phone as students to learn and to revise different procedures and techniques. Virtual reality, as I mentioned before, with the virtual animal anatomy from Colorado State, is much more immersive and it's a very sensory environment. So here you can see there's a mask that's being used in order to be fully immersed within the virtual environment for learning the structure of the bones, the muscles, the nerves, and so on, and comparing between species as well. So again, one method, it doesn't always need to be virtual reality, nor does virtual reality need to necessarily involve haptics, the simulation of the sense of touch. But for the right teaching objectives, haptic technology is a very useful addition to the virtual reality simulation. In this case, the haptic cow, and there's also a haptic horse, developed largely by the University of Bristol in the UK, combining the virtual reality software with a mannequin, so students can be looking at the stage of pregnancy and doing examinations. And again, very, very effective tool, utilizing all the power of technology to support the learning process. It's also worth remembering, of course, that haptic technology is a hands-on technology. Computer simulation doesn't necessarily mean it's not hands-on. But when you do need hands-on experience of real animal and animal tissue, how can we meet those teaching objectives in a fully ethical way? And we would argue for the use of ethically sourced animal cadavers, organs, and tissues. Animal body donation programs linked to veterinary teaching hospitals or networks of private clinics can help provide the bodies that can be used within education for dissection as one of many methods to learn anatomy or surgical anatomy. In the Netherlands, you can see here this image. There is a nationwide program linking up veterinary practices with the University of Utrecht, and companion animal guardians or pet owners can donate the body of their deceased pet into the learning program in order to help the spirit of their animal live on through the better training of future veterinarians. So the public and the university are very well linked in a positive relationship. And this is also facilitated by the animal protection organization Proof de Vrij in the country. Acceptable other sources is something that we explain in our policy for where animals are not free living, but we would prefer that ethically sourced is the source of animal cadavers in order to make sure that the ethical level of such a program is at its highest. So free living animals who died naturally or in accidents or had to be euthanized for medical reasons will be considered ethically sourced according to our policy, and non-free living animals but that still died in the same way, so accidents or through genuine euthanasia, so putting the animal down for its own benefit, for his or her own benefit, they would be considered an acceptable other source. So, for example, cows, camels, and so on, that generally are not free living, but often used as work animals or farmed animals. If they died naturally and there's no other source of such cadavers, then that will be acceptable as well. So this is explored further within our policy. But certainly body donation programs can provide those cadavers, and such cadavers can be used either fresh, they can be chilled, they can be frozen, or they can be prepared to be used in other ways. So preservation is another option for the use of such cadavers. There is plastination. You might remember the Body World's exhibition of plastinated humans and animals. And these can provide, of course, specimens for teaching labs, teaching museums, and such specimens can last, again, decades. There's also more low-cost methods of preservation, similar to plastination, but which can be simpler to achieve. And the El Nadi technique is another method for preserving specimens. And such specimens also have a little bit more flexibility, so it can be used within more clinical skills and surgical training as well. Such cadavers can either be used fresh or sometimes can be prepared, frozen, defrosted and used. And here you can see a couple of opportunities. First, the POP trainer, pulsating organ perfusion trainer from Optimist, the company in Austria, for training mostly human laparoscopic techniques, minimally invasive surgery, but also it can be used for veterinary surgery in the growing application of laparoscopic surgery in that field as well. So in this case, generally waste material from a slaughterhouse is used, but ethically sourced material could also be used instead. And over time, the resolution of the vessels within 3D printing, I think, can also replace the use of any animal material within this trainer as well. But the opportunity to perfuse and add pulsation to organs and tissue is also very valuable in order to use different tools, use new tools, and of course manage the bleeding, which is such a crucial aspect of surgical training. On the right, you can see Dr. Emad Aboud, and he's a neurosurgeon, Syrian-American neurosurgeon, and he perfuses mostly human donated heads or bodies in order to practice surgery, particularly neurosurgery. And his method, Aboud's living cadaver method, animates those cadavers to produce a sort of live surgery experience with bleeding. So that's another area of potential application within veterinary medicine too. Clinical work with animal patients, including surgery, is another type of alternative. Of course, within human medicine, the apprenticeship process and the many years of developing those skills and specializing is a standard way of training for medical students and trainees. In veterinary medicine, the students are expected to be competent upon graduation. So there's a lot of challenges there in terms of enhancing the range of tools and approaches and opportunities that students have through creative curricular design and the implementation of such good alternative tools in order to create or get as close as you can to mastery, so that upon graduation, students are as prepared as possible for their work in the clinic or in other areas. So clinical learning opportunities with teaching hospitals and with independent clinics and access to those for the students is really important. What I think is valuable about clinical and surgical learning opportunities is that they're often very case-based and they're highly realistic. It's experiential training. You get to see the whole of the clinical environment and process, from meeting the client to the diagnosis, the recognition of different behaviors, the observation and then involvement in and then performance of minor procedures under supervision, and of course following work with non-animal models and mannequins first. And then within the clinic, within the operating theatre, gradually being apprenticed into more and more complex and complicated procedures. So I think it's even after this, you have learning aspects too. You get to see the recovery and to be involved in that post-operative care as well, and that's crucial too. So it's a much more rounded and comprehensive opportunity than an isolated animal experiments causing problems, of course, including pain and death potentially for the animal, and with a lot of ethical issues, the stress the student might have, the upset concerning animals being used harmfully for their learning their healing profession. And I think a context of healing is very, very important. So clinics and outreach is really important. What you also get to learn that the animal experiment doesn't provide is caring as a clinical skill. Often caring and emotions are seen as something, at best, as an accessory element to the course, or at worst as an irritation, as something that's somehow going to conflict with your clinical detachment and your procedural skill. But in fact, these are all together. You can't have a good procedure, a successful procedure, if you don't care for the patient. You need to be able to also manage your emotional aspects, I think, your emotional skills and qualities, and see how those things, how those qualities and skills interact with the importance of clinical detachment and effective procedural work as well. So you might be able to bear in mind the healing context and make sure that everything is going to be the best for this patient. And then you gradually, consciously desensitize yourself for a period in order to focus on the procedural aspects with your clinical detachment. And then as you finish this, consciously bring back the emotional element with the caring and the postoperative care for that patient. And then you haven't been desensitized through animal experimentation in your training and lost some of the emotional skills you need to be an effective doctor, but you are recognizing that there is an interplay between that clinical detachment and the emotional context, but you're able to manage that interplay in order to bring in every element and every benefit of those different skills for the procedure and for the well-being and recovery of that animal. So I think caring as a clinical skill is crucial for vets to learn. You can have more accurate diagnosis and better treatment, more interest in the field and its developments when you care. And of course, the use of these alternatives support the development of this skill. Animal volunteers are another alternative. Volunteer is not quite the right word when, of course, we're dealing with animals. How do we ensure consent and involvement? But certainly what we can do is ensure that if we're going to work with living animals, that those animals get some benefit and certainly have no harm from their involvement in the practical class. So this is a project in the UK, Horses Inside Out, where horses are painted with non-toxic paints in order to illustrate anatomy and biomechanics. So this is a living anatomy lesson. And I think this is very important, not just for companion animal guardians, the horse owners, but also for veterinary students who can really understand how the skeleton moves, where the different organs are, and the nerves and other structures, and to see those in motion. And I think that's another important aspect of anatomy, is to see it illustrated with living animals. So this is a project that we've also filmed that will be in a future episode of our veterinary education documentary film series. What's important, I think, is that the animal that is worked with, we could say used, but I think worked with would be better in this case, is that the animal experiences no discomfort and has only rewards for their involvement. So social interaction for those individuals that like social interaction only, of course, and perhaps treats such as food. And being painted is also a form of massage too, for the right horse. So I think this animal volunteer, we could say, gets benefits, and the students do as well. You can also do experiments on yourself, non-invasive, of course, experiments, especially within physiology and pharmacology. Here you can see the BioPack student lab. This is typically used within human medicine, but could be used to a greater degree within veterinary medicine too. And you have the opportunity, of course, to do simple procedures such as nerve physiology, muscle physiology, exercise and respiratory physiology experiments on yourself and within groups. So by connecting the apparatus to yourself and linking up with the computer, you can give yourself a very minor electric shock, which you'll hardly feel, but where you can measure the evoked nerve impulse. I think that's very important to be practicing on your own body. It's often fun as well. So it's a good learning environment by having a positive and fun environment rather than a stressful and unpleasant and unethical animal experiment, for example. But also having it on your own body can make it more memorable. It's certainly the appropriate reference object for medical students. But I think also as mammals, it's also very good for veterinary students to have that experience because of the commonality between species, but also to know what things are like on your own body. So a combination here is, I think, is a good example to show how two different types of tool and approach can be used for one particular practical class and one course. A combination of a virtual laboratory software, such as SimNerve and SimMuscle, combined with self-experimentation, student self-experimentation, together can be really excellent for learning in those courses. So you have the opportunity to gain all the knowledge, the understanding, the principles with the software, and then to apply them on the living human, the living mammal, the living vertebrate. And I think that's together, that's very good. So typically combinations of tools and approach can be very, very valuable. And in every educational situation, combinations of tools are often used. But even within one particular class, one particular topic, a combination of 2 or 3 different tools can be very valuable. Similarly, in vitro labs is another tool. Students can do experiments with plant material in some cases. This is a lab where you can do cell respiration experiments by deriving mitochondria from turnips, the vegetable, instead of deriving mitochondria from killed rats from the liver. So sometimes direct replacement between animal and plant material can provide you with a practical class doing exactly the same. Otherwise, you can derive ethically sourced material from human or animal cadavers for use in vitro. And of course, the growing field of in vitro technology within research and testing is very important for students to be aware of during their education. They can learn about such alternatives in research and testing, but they can also do similar in vitro work in order to gain knowledge and skills for their particular class at that level of their education within their faculty as part of their education. So in vitro labs can help not only gain knowledge and skills, but also prepare you for humane science as well. And finally, ethical field studies, getting out of the lab into the field, focusing on, especially on observational work and seeing animals in their ecological context, rather than, again, having animals removed from those contexts or bred and kept in the lab or seen only in the clinic. So wildlife biology and the veterinary aspects of that, veterinarians who might be working in the sort of conservation area or with wild animals or even strays, again, an opportunity to get out and do work, I think, is very important. And similar to clinical learning opportunities where students can go out and do spay-neuter work, which is very important for them to practice and practice again after working with the mannequins in community projects, doing spay-neuter work in low-income neighborhoods, in even in other countries, doing work that might link well with conservation work. I think also there's an opportunity here for work with wildlife as well. And again, in our policy, we address ethical field studies and when work with wild animals is or is not appropriate, in our opinion. There's another myth, I think, that we can address here, and that is that if you use alternatives, the students or the trainees won't have hands-on experience of animals and animal tissues. But as you'll have seen with the ethically sourced animal cadavers, organs, and tissue type of alternative, and the clinical and surgical opportunities with real animal patients, healing context, not harming context, this is not true. Alternatives doesn't mean you don't use or work with real living animals. So replacement can involve animals through the ethically sourced way and as a clinician. So this is very important to remember, that there is work with animals as well as non-animal tools where knowledge and skills and attitudes can be developed, can be gained very effectively. Okay, let's have a look at some video clips now as a break from me talking. These are excerpts, and there's 4 short clips from the case study of surgery and the Sindava canine that you've seen some images from already. And this is an episode that's about to be launched in and also in 22 different translations, from Latin American Spanish to French and German, Arabic, simplified and traditional Chinese, and so on. And this episode is one episode within the series of 4 episodes that are under production. Most of the footage has been gained already, so it's a question of editing. And this particular episode is a case study where we look at surgical skills acquisition and specifically the Sindava canine for that process. So let's have a look now at these 4 individual clips. First, the enterotomy, resection, and anastomosis lab following the demonstration of the abdomen.
Going further in, we're going to go ahead and, in this case, if the abdominal plate was opened, we would exteriorize the intestine. And again, as a good surgeon, you are thorough in your exploration and will feel of the intestine and determine that there are certain irregularities here that you don't want to miss. So as you go further in, lo and behold, here's a foreign object. So it feels kind of like a dice. How would I deal with this particular thing? Well, you would do an enterotomy. So at this point, you would cut, remove that foreign material, sew it up. But there's another issue here too. There's a pathology, an area of irregularity, perhaps damage that was done by the dice. So this would guide us to consider this area an area where I would do an anastomosis.
What is going to be the preservation of your blood supply? And this is the hardest portion to figure out, I think, with a resection and anastomosis. Twofold is where to cut and what blood supply to save. And so again, if we're pretending that we need to remove all the sutures of the enterotomy, what arcades need to go and what arcades need to stay? You have great blood supply from this jejunal arcade to supply this from this end. So then in theory, if you want to save this, right, where would you place the ligatures? Because we want to also think that we're going to want to make our cut away from the mesenteric surface at an angle, right? Yeah. We don't want to make it this way because then the tip of the blood supply is going to be poor here. So the way that you do have your carmelis placed is appropriate. You want to actually pretend like you're placing a suture almost at the base of the intestine and ligating so that it's not bleeding. And it actually is like a very prominent artery that'll spurt at you. And so they can be a pain. So I find trying to create an environment for success before you cut the intestine is important, because once you cut the intestine, you're trying to get it back together as soon as you can. So plan, have everything set, then cut the intestine.
You can see the importance of mentoring and the opportunity that working with a mannequin can present in such labs. Now let's look at the dropped ovarian pedicle emergency lab, which is something that can develop after a spay. And you'll see not only the practical technical aspects, but also the emotional management aspects, which is very important.
Going further back, you can appreciate the stomach and the omentum, which is draping all of the intestine. This is a female dog. It's also designed as a spay trainer. We do have the reproductive tract represented. It also has the suspensory ligaments, the broad ligament, it has the horns, ovary, you would have to approach the abdomen, go in and break down that suspensory ligament, ligate the ovarian vasculature, and then come down, break it down, and remove this as you would a common spay. One of the concerns we have as surgeons who might do an ovarian hysterectomy is a condition called a drop pedicle. So in the process of doing this procedure, if you did not ligate properly or were distracted or you sneezed or some problem arose, you might happen to not close the vessels that feed the ovary properly. Upon losing that or dropping into the abdomen, it'll bleed freely, and that is considered an emergency.
Really? Oh, yes, technically.
Okay.
I found it. We're just gonna go into cardiopulmonary arrest. I got it.
And finally, what are the multiple objectives that such a lab can provide for the students and for the teachers themselves?
I think really the Sindava lab accomplishes multiple facets or multiple goals. One is to try and remove students' natural fear of surgery. It's very hard to behave with good competency and calmness when you feel stressed or afraid. The second is to encourage an enthusiasm for the procedures and for surgery in general, and encourage them in the idea that your surgical training is an iterative process. You acquire a skill, you practice it, you discover that you need another skill, you go learn it, you practice that, you constantly improve, and that's a lifelong career commitment. And the third is to give them a basic skill set which will translate into any surgical procedure that they undertake.
Okay, so hopefully those clips were helpful. All again were from Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine, and the last speaker you saw was Dr. Galina Hayes, who is working within the advanced surgical training area and the teaching hospital as well. So let's look now at the teaching objectives and the broader impact of developing and implementing such tools. Firstly, we have standard teaching objectives, understanding nerve physiology, mastering the skill of enterotomy. And these teaching objectives can be met better using these humane innovations and these ethical approaches. The published studies, and you can see over 1,000 at our free access studies database on our website at interniche.org, that reflect that assess and look at the development and implementation of such tools, often look at the sort of technical aspects of the development of such tools, and then how well the students or trainees are acquiring these. The comparative studies, including the reviews, show that actually in almost every case, students are learning equally or in a superior way to using animals harmfully, to the animal experiment or the dissection of a purpose-killed animal. However, it's worth bearing in mind that these comparisons often look at one particular practice using animals harmfully and one particular product or one particular tool, and typically multiple tools will be used. Similarly, I think we need to bear in mind that to organize a really high level efficient assessment and validation of such tools could really take many, many years. These tools are often developed by the teachers themselves for their multiple positive impact, but particularly the pedagogical aspects, the more effective gaining of teaching objectives, so meeting of teaching objectives. So they're often implemented already and are demonstrating a better learning environment, and that students can gain and retain these skills, the knowledge and the skills more effectively. So the evidence is beyond just the detailed studies and the comparative studies and the reviews. It's also in very widespread experience of teachers who've developed and implemented the tools already. But you can learn better, we would argue, in every case when you're using humane innovations and ethical approaches. But this is just standard teaching objectives. We also need to be thinking about what those objectives are, auditing courses, identifying them, thinking whether those need to be reassessed, focusing on knowledge and skills acquisition, and being aware of the studies, but I think not limited by them. What other objectives can be met, we can address as well. So there are opportunities provided by curricular redesign and by the use of these innovative technologies that weren't there before when animals were used harmfully, or indeed when there wasn't even a tool for a certain class at all. For example, mastering a specific new surgery, giving you exposure to a particular condition that you might not meet as a professional in the veterinary clinic for maybe 10 years or more. You can practice, be exposed to them within your training with the use of a tool that has been developed to illustrate that particular condition, and for you to have the opportunity to address it. And as I mentioned before, also you can develop new skills such as caring as a clinical skill, and you can practice and become better at that as well. So there are new things that you can do, new objectives that you can meet when you use alternatives too. But beyond those two areas, there's also what we call the hidden curriculum. This is the implicit group of lessons and messages that students and trainees might be presented with through the use of particular harmful animal practices that are usually negative. For example, habituating the student or trainee into instrumental use of animals, facilitating the process of desensitization, of caring less, of limiting your compassion and empathy, and of teaching conformity, doing the same practice as always has been done, instead of thinking, just like in the research area, that actually everything's in flux, everything can change, new evidence can push you to change your mindset, your beliefs, and your practices. When you're using alternatives, not only is the teacher demonstrating more critical thinking skills, I think, by being willing to reassess the curriculum and the tools that are used, but also the individual tools that students might use can encourage critical thinking rather than conformity too. So alternatives can obviate or remove the negative hidden curriculum. I think the world of alternatives is also much more in accordance with life science philosophy. Biology is the study of life, medicine and veterinary medicine as healing arts and science, and also the critical thinking being an essential skill, not only for use later, perhaps within further sort of exploration of the scientific method, but also just as someone who's able to think clearly, identify issues and help solve them. Emotional literacy can be supported better. These skills and qualities that I mentioned before can all be not only encouraged, but you can also avoid them being lost. And I think this is crucial within a profession that's about healing animals. And you can also, I think, maintain and develop your emotional competence. And you saw the lab with the dropped ovarian pedicle earlier in terms of learning to deal with an emergency and to do that within a safe and controlled environment, but still that is quite stressful. You can practice that in advance. You'll be better prepared for the real life scenario when it comes. And you can also avoid desensitization and the stunting of emotional literacy that can achieve. So there's opportunities here for personal and professional growth on the emotional literacy front. Ethically also, I think a lot of benefits can be gained. When you use alternatives, they're ethically rooted. You yourself can be ethically rooted and develop your sort of competence in this area, develop your sense of responsibility. And I think this is very important in the professions because you're always faced with ethical issues that you need to identify and solve. So practice them now within your education, You can do that not only within a context that is free of harm to animals, but also you can further develop it using these models that allow for example, management of in difficult situations like stressful scenarios. So I think overall, ethical literacy is another area of great benefit brought about by the use of these replacement alternatives. Accessibility and inclusivity are also important. When you have a range of tools that can perhaps be more suitable to reflect the range of different points of entry in terms of skills, but also different styles of learning, the different psychologies of the students who are entering into the class, then you're more likely to have a more accessible and inclusive veterinary faculty and course as a whole. And I think you can also avoid the issues of discriminating against students who might have religious or moral beliefs that are not in accordance with harmful animal use. So freedom of conscience and civil liberties issues can also be addressed. You can have full freedom of conscience for students, and there's no need for anyone to conscientiously object to harmful animal use, because you've already got an ethical course or group of courses. That doesn't mean it can't be further enhanced, further improved, but the main big issue of harming animals in education training has been solved. I think when teachers and institutes are really committed to reassessing the curriculum and developing and implementing innovative tools and ethical approaches, then the reputations of those teachers and of those faculties can be significantly enhanced. I know when Tufts University in the US developed its body donation program for small and then large animals as well, actually, and linked to the plastination process, which was a program initially developed by one student who was willing to sort of make good use of animal cadavers and help replace the animals killed for dissection. It was then adopted by the faculty, and it started to attract students specifically because animals weren't being killed for the process. So very much in terms of reputation, I think we can bear that in mind too. Animal freedom, animals not being killed or harmed for the process, we can guarantee animal freedom by achieving full replacement too. Ecologically, animals might not be taken from the wild. Alternatives that can be used, whether software or models, for many, many years are often more ecological than continually taking animals from the wild, breeding them, killing them, disposing of them, and so on. So there can be a positive or at least a largely minimized negative impact. And this goes beyond just the student situation and the animals used in education and the quality of education that the teachers are providing. This will of course also feed into the professions, the quality of the professions within veterinary clinical work or humane research, and the healthcare that's being provided to animals. So the impact of education, of creating really good quality education, goes far beyond the faculty itself. It goes out into humane science, it goes out into society. So this is very, very important. Economically, while some tools can be very expensive, others are free. The body donation program makes good use of an existing resource. Some software is free. There's a huge amount of online slides and images of anatomy and pathology and so on, as well as some programs in physiology that are available for free. Other software can be very, very cheap. So there's a wide range of options here, and you can also make your own tools, whether it's 3D printing or making your own software, and that can often use existing resources and, of course, existing skills. And finally, legislation. Legislation demands, where it exists, that alternatives should be used wherever possible. It's our experience that every practical class within veterinary medicine, within all the disciplines within veterinary medicine, veterinary medical education and training, have been met, have been organized using humane tools and approaches only. There's always a class somewhere where only alternatives are used. And the progress in that area is very, very positive. So, of course, there are continuing practices that are harmful, animal experiments, killing for dissections, other harmful animal use, and those could be replaced with these humane tools or combinations of these tools and ethical approaches. But so I think the feasibility of using replacement-only methods has been demonstrated. And that's one reason why we like the case study approach, because it's impossible to know exactly what's happening in every class, every practical class, in every course, in every department, in every faculty across the world. But we can use case studies to show where only alternatives are used within different classes. And that's what our film series is going to be using, and also a future book of case studies. So we can be more in accordance with legislation when we implement such tools. Looking at the resources that we can offer, I've mentioned the information resources online. We have our book, a little old now, but certainly the curricular design and case studies content is still relevant. You can download this from our website. The documentary on veterinary education and book that I mentioned before. Our website and database is here. And you can see the alternatives database, and you can click on each item and find out more information on each product. The studies database that you can filter and search as well, not just on the development, but the implementation and sometimes assessment of such tools. And we also have libraries of alternatives, so you can borrow items for free. Sometimes we can offer small grants and freeware to people who want to use them. We support students who conscientiously object. There are also, of course, teachers who refuse to use animals harmfully and have developed or implemented tools themselves. And there's conferences, outreach, tours, and training. And we'll be at the 12th World Congress at the end of this August in Niagara Falls in the US, with some of these tools for you to see there as well. And I'll also be speaking there about the film series. There's free resources like virtual physiology that I mentioned, information resources where you can find out more. You can produce your own materials and think about collaborating between graphic designers and physiologists and programmers, and think across disciplines, think across faculties too, because many of these ideas have applications in other areas too. And there's also, of course, other sources of funding, such as the Lush Prize, to reward developments and positive implementation and replacement of such tools. And there's one training aspect to the Lush Prize as well that you might consider applying for. So in conclusion, we believe that alternatives are superior to harmful animal use, that 100% replacement of that harmful animal use is indeed possible, that there's a diverse range of tools and approaches that can meet teaching objectives in every practical class, that there's a growing momentum and successes with alternatives now considered the norm, and the word not really being used anymore because these are just better tools. And we can remember that this is a win-win situation. There's multiple positive impacts of the implementation. Students have access to best practice, high quality tools and approaches so can learn better. Teachers can pass on their knowledge and skills more effectively with well-designed, well-considered tools and approaches. The professions win because better skilled people can graduate and enter into them. And society benefits as a whole with these professionals working more ethically and better trained within it. And of course, the animals not being harmed, not being hurt, either not being used at all or being worked with within an ethical context of the veterinary teaching hospital and clinical learning opportunities. So multiple positive impact. Everyone can win from this. And while there are, of course, some challenges, there's so many opportunities. I think this is one reason why there's been so much good replacement with the range of tools and approaches that have been produced and the different methods that people have realized can better meet teaching objectives. So thank you very much for listening.